Oh, hello, I'm live. Hello, happy Friday. It's me, Alex Cox, back again with another Friday's live broadcast. Facebook's just booting up, so I cannot quite yet tell whether anybody's watching. If you're there, I hope you are. Hello. Oh, yes, I know I can see we've got 5 people tuned in already. Happy Friday, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll give it a few more moments just between. Oh, hello, William. Nice and prompt. Good to see you. Hello, Anya. Hope you're well. It's good to be back, actually. I feel like I haven't done one of these for quite some time now. Great. We're up to 24 viewers. We will let it tick up a little bit more. Hello, everybody. Hello, Rodney in Toronto. Hello, Amanda. Amanda, thank you so much for your submission, by the way. That was quite powerful. We really enjoyed reading that. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Hello, Ellen. Hello, Hillary. Great. We're up to, yeah, I think we'll start. We're 1 minute in, so people hopefully still carry on joining. But anyway, so happy Friday. It's good to be here. What are we talking about today? Well, it's quite a poignant topic. Given that tomorrow is VJ Day in the UK, Australia, actually it's in a number of other countries. So tomorrow VJ Day is acknowledged in Australia, New Zealand, and Korea. It's acknowledged in the United States on the 2nd of September and in China, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Taiwan, Macau, all those regions on September the 3rd. So with that in mind, I thought today we really should be taking a look at the war in the Far East, because tomorrow marks the 75th anniversary of victory over Japan. And from my perspective, Britain's war in the Far East was not something that I was overly familiar with. I think so much attention is put on the war in Europe, the war with Germany. I mean, so many of us have done loads of reading, about myself included, about the Dunkirk evacuation, the D-Day landings, the Battle for France, Arnhem Bridge. The war with Germany is definitely discussed more than the war in the Far East. I don't think that's quite so true for the US, because of course the terrible fighting the US Marines experienced in the Pacific is very well remembered and very well examined. So yeah, I wanted to take today as an opportunity to take a look back at this important anniversary, and we will be focusing on Britain's war in the Far East. And to do that, I've pulled out a selection of stories that I've found in our various World War II collections. They're incredible stories. I will try my best to do them justice, and there's quite a few to discuss. So we will see how we get on for time. So just a few quick looks. Hello, Alan Bennett. Hello, Rosie. Hello, Jackie. Hello, Ian. Hello, Roy. Hello, Karen. Good to see you too. Hello, Linda. Hello, Mobo, Barton White. Top of the morning to you too. Hello, Nicole. Yeah, the beard is back. Much to my wife's displeasure. It'll be going very soon. Hello, Sherry. Hello, Roz. Hello, Lynn. Hello, Jean. Hello, Beverly. Hello. Wow, so many people. It's very, very good to see you all. Hello, Sam. Hello, Kildare. John, I'm just going to say hello to everybody, because otherwise I'm going to spend the entire video saying hello to everybody, which I would enjoy doing, but we've got so much to discuss. As Anya has just reminded me, I also did a similar discussion with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission yesterday on their Facebook page. I personally felt it went very well, and I enjoyed it immensely, so I recommend you guys checking that out if you are interested. Also, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission do their own live broadcasts, and as you will see in the video we did yesterday, their historians and experts are incredibly knowledgeable, and they're great to watch. And the Commonwealth War Graves Commission do such great work, so do follow them as well. Check out their broadcasts and tune in. If anybody did watch yesterday, there'll be a slight little bit of repetition, because I also want to discuss the story of Lieutenant Hill, which I'll say more about in a moment. But yeah, main purpose of today is to do a little bit of storytelling. So rather than tips for research, it's going to be a bit more like a podcast, where we look at some truly incredible stories of sacrifice, struggle, survival, because war is never pleasant, but the war in the Far East was up there in the list of unpleasant conflicts. I mean, I'm certainly very glad myself that I was born today and have never had to experience anything like that. So hello to everybody. Karen's just said we just held a bell ceremony to mark the anniversary of the dropping of the Hiroshima bomb. Oh wow, yeah. Again, that is something. We're not just remembering British casualties of war. We're remembering all casualties of war. On VJ Day, millions of people lost their life. It was the bloodiest conflict in human history for a reason. So yeah, if you're tuning into this for the first time, we do these every single week, every single Friday. It's an opportunity for us to share some of the interesting things we discover, but also let you know what's going on at Findmypast, what's coming up, keep you in the loop, basically. But also, it's a great opportunity for us all to speak to each other. We're all family history enthusiasts, so this is a great place for us to bond over our shared passion. And if you're a beginner, if you're a new researcher, if you're just dipping your toes into the water of online research, there are a lot of incredibly knowledgeable and kind, generous people in the comments who every week I see help people with queries, tips, questions. So if you have any questions today about genealogy, Findmypast, getting started, please do pop them in the comments and ask. I will try my best to answer some as we go through, but I also know that some of our heroes in the comments will be quick to help as well. So before we dig into the main event, I just wanted to give you a quick update on the records we have launched. Oh, no, that's what I forgot to mention as well. Question of the week. So to get the ball rolling and to get the comments flowing, we like to ask a question at the start of these videos just to facilitate discussion, really. And given that we're talking about VJ Day, this week's question of the week is, tell us in what ways you have commemorated the sacrifices and struggles of your ancestors. They don't have to be military ancestors. Have you ever visited a grave? That's something I've been experimenting with recently. Now I've been locating where my ancestors are buried in Twickenham. I've been paying my respects and going to visit their graves. I was very lucky to accompany my grandfather over to Normandy a couple of years ago and retrace his steps because he part of the D-Day landing. So that's something I personally did. But yeah, I would love to hear who you remember and how you do it. We've also already had some fantastic submissions on this. So, for example, Kimberly Thompson, one of our very regular viewers. Hello, Kim. Thanks for this. Has said, this weekend I'm remembering my great uncle Robert John Hood, who died in 1944, starting with the virtual Sandokan Memorial 2020 in the early hours of tomorrow morning. He was born in East London and spent some time in an institute as his parents couldn't afford to feed him and his siblings. Tough start to life. At the age of 18, he had worked, saved, and was sponsored to make a new life in Australia. He lived in Queensland until the outbreak of the war. There, he joined the reserves of the Australian International Force and was quickly deployed. When Singapore fell in early 1942, he was one of those captured and sent to Changi. Oh, Changi was, they were all bad, but Changi was a bad one. And then taken to Ubi Maru, on the Ubi Maru to Sandokan in July 1942. He never made it out of there, dying of malaria in December 1944 at the age of 39. His remains haven't been formally identified, and his existence in the camp amounts to his pay book and a report by the Japanese of his death. Wow. The more I read about the conditions at the camp, the more horrified I am at what they went through. He has taught me that life is short and to make every day count. Kim also kindly shared a photo of her ancestor that you can see in her comment. But I love that. I particularly love the way you ended that, Kim, because I do think that is very, very true. Doing our family history can very much influence the way we live our lives today, and can help inform our decisions and the connections we make in the now. Another one that was sent in that almost made me cry was Amanda Webb's. Amanda said, she's proved who her real great-grandfather was through DNA, James Harrison, and he had a very tough life, being kicked in the head by a horse, becoming brain damaged, and was put away in an asylum, forgotten by our family, and the rest of his life was very sad to read from his asylum patient records. He can now take his rightful place in our family. Again, that's why family history research is such a worthwhile thing to do. You are retelling and remembering the stories of normal people who did not make it into the history books. It doesn't matter if they weren't generals, captains of industry, politicians, heads of state. Every story matters, and through online research, you're uniquely placed to tell them. And sometimes you will be the first person remembering that person in a very long time. But Amanda went on to say, last year I discovered more about my two great uncles, Samuel Charles Weldon and Frank Brown. Both tragically lost their lives in World War One. Found a memorial with Frank's name on and discovered where Samuel was buried, both in France. Last year, on Remembrance Sunday, I felt inspired to write a poem, which I won't read because I don't have a man's express permission, but it's a beautiful poem. And if you'd like to see that, have a look at the comments, right? Take a quick look at what everyone's saying. Royston saying hello from the Rhondda Valley, beautiful part of the world. Rodney in Toronto, hello. Rita, greetings from Cherry Hill in New Jersey. I always love it when people from the US are tuning in. I'm not quite sure what time it is for you. I'm assuming it's early in the morning. Audrey, hello. In Chesham. Great to hear from you, Audrey, as always. Tracy in Gloucestershire. June in Sun City, Arizona. Well, I imagine the weather where you are is remarkably different to where we are. It's very grey and miserable in the UK right now. Anyway, right, let's crack on. So before we take a look at some of these stories, I just wanted to give you a quick update on the records we have added this week, because in my humble opinion, they are rather interesting. So for all you newspaper fans, this week's Findmypast Friday update is made up pretty much exclusively of official government gazettes. Hundreds of years of them, actually, going all the way back to 1665. So first up, we published a near complete run of the London Gazette from 1665 to 2018. If you're wondering what the London Gazette is a newspaper of record. It was an official way for the government to communicate notices, official notices, throughout the United Kingdom. And we have 350 years of it, about 34 million records that counts as. And it is a goldmine of historical information. I mean, you'll find everything in there, from insolvency notices to deaths to legal notices, matters around estates, matters of state, profiles. It's a very great context builder. It's a great way of finding out what was going on and what was being talked about when your ancestor was alive, what the events they lived through, basically. But that's not all. We've also added the Scotland Edinburgh Gazette, which was the official newspaper record for Scotland. It was launched a little bit after the London Gazette, I believe, and the run we have on Findmypast now is from 1797 to 2018. As well as that, we've got the Ireland Belfast Gazette from 1922 to 2018, and the Dublin Gazette as well from 1750 to 1800. If you want to get a bit of a more detailed overview of what's in there, check out the latest records section of our blog, where you will be able to read in detail all about these gazettes. But yeah, we're very pleased to have them on the site. Really long kind of chronology of records there, with some truly fascinating stuff in there. Stories that haven't been read before, just waiting for you to go and discover them. Anyway, right, back to VJ Day. So, what is VJ Day? Well, the name kind of says it all. It is the official celebration of victory over Japan and the war in the Far East. As I said, it's celebrated in Britain tomorrow, and in New Zealand, Australia and Korea, where the United States celebrate it on September the 2nd. So the first VJ Day happened 75 years ago tomorrow. And there were huge celebrations and street parties, not quite at the same scale as the VE Day celebrations in London and across the UK. But if you look in our Findmypast photo collection, you will see plenty of images of people enjoying street parties, and just the sheer sense of relief on their face that these years of bloody conflict are finally at an end, and they can go about living their lives, reclaiming their youth if they were young. Oh, Rita McLean said, this is an interesting topic for me. My father served in the US Navy in the Pacific Theatre during World War II. Well, I'm very pleased to hear it, Rita. Hopefully, I will be mainly focusing on British Armed Forces, but hopefully you will find some of this illuminating and interesting. But anyway, let's have a quick look at Britain's war in the Far East, because as I said before, I wasn't particularly familiar with it. So, fought between December 1941 and August 1945, British Commonwealth troops, and it's very important to add the Commonwealth there, because this was very much a Commonwealth effort. I mean, one of the things I will also be talking about today is the incredible contribution made by Indian troops, something I feel is often overlooked. So anyway, between this period, the Commonwealth forces fought a bitter war against the Japanese military across Asia. It took place in all over the place, from the malaria-ridden jungles of Burma to Hong Kong, the famous fall of Singapore, and fighting conditions were not pleasant. You know, you were dealing with tropical diseases, berry fever, malaria, dengue, drenching monsoon rains, stranded on remote tropical islands, searing heat, cold nights, hostile wildlife, and not to mention a tenacious and cunning enemy who were very, very, very good at fighting in the jungle. They knew the territory well. They knew how to use it to their advantage. They were a fearsome foe, very much so. So it all started when the Japanese first struck on the 7th December 1941. Of course, you know this date. It is one of the most recognized dates in history, when the Japanese attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and then declared war on Britain and the United States. The British colony of Hong Kong was attacked the very next day. It held out for a while, but surrendered finally on the 25th of December, with significant numbers of military personnel and civilians taken prisoner by the Japanese. The Japanese then landed troops in the Philippines, also British territories in Malaya, Borneo as well, and several other Allied held staging posts in the Pacific Ocean. The Dutch East Indies as well were very rapidly swept through by the Japanese. They'd already occupied French Indochina, which now we know as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And they'd actually been fighting in China since 1937. But the key moments, I think, for the British Armed Forces are the first months of 1942, because the Japanese then launched even more attacks against the British in Burma, the Australians in New Guinea and Papua. And the purpose of these campaigns, it was very tactical. They wanted to safeguard oil, rubber, and other raw materials that the Japanese really needed to keep in the fight, because these were materials they did not have access to themselves, which is part of the reason Japan went to war in the first place. They felt very boxed in by the West, and their dreams of expansion weren't possible with the current colonial setup in those regions. So they very quickly created this very strongly fortified perimeter around what by that time was a pretty economically self-sufficient Japan, and that they believed they could basically defend this until the Allies got tired of the war. That was their basic strategy, really. So other high watermark moments are the 8th of December 1941, when the Japanese landed in Malaya. They landed at Singora and Batari in Thailand, which immediately signed an armistice. As I said before, the Japanese were very good at fighting in the jungles. Landings also occurred in Kota Baru in northern Malaya, and they basically succeeded in making incredibly rapid advances through the jungle. By the 25th of February that same year, they'd fought their way to Singapore, which was Britain's major military base in the Far East, a complete keystone of its regional defence system. When Singapore fell, Britain's chances of seriously contesting Japanese aggression was very much reduced. It's known as one of those humiliating defeats in British military history for good reason. They caught the British completely by surprise. Part of that was inadequate planning, very little jungle training. British military authorities had pretty poor intelligence and low morale, and this Japanese attack came out of nowhere. The command structure was confused, morale was quickly affected, there was very poor air cover, and all of this together contributed to quite a rapid defeat in Malaya. And as the Americans did too, but the British and Americans did very much underestimate how battle-hardened and tough and determined the Japanese were. So, of course, the next watermark would be the fall of Singapore, which happened on the 31st of January 1942. British units crossed to the island. Sorry, that's not when the fall happened. That's when British units arrived. British units, sorry, ignore me there. British units crossed onto the island of Singapore on the 31st of January 1942, destroyed its causeway, and basically prepared for an old-fashioned style siege. Unfortunately, their defences were pretty much designed to a seaborne attack, and they weren't expecting the Japanese to come through the jungle. This is a very well-known story, and that's basically what happened. The Japanese snuck through the jungle, took them completely by surprise, and on September the 15th, 1942, Commander at Singapore, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, who had no air cover whatsoever, signed the surrender, and thousands and thousands of Allied troops were taken prisoner. So that's a bit of a summary. And that leads us on to the first story I would like to look at. So this is the story of a man called Lieutenant Harry Hill. Not the famous British comedian, no, this was Lieutenant Harry Hill of the Indian Army Service Corps. And before I talk about Lieutenant Harry Hill's story, I should probably say how we discovered it. So, for all of you there watching, thinking, how do I go about exploring my World War II ancestors? Well, for those of you watching in Britain, all British Army and Air Force and Navy World War II service records are still held by the Ministry of Defence. So they're not available online, but you can request them by visiting the gov.uk website. You'll need a little bit of information. Normally, I think you have to prove you're an next of kin. So there's two reasons. The person whose records you want have to be deceased. If not, you have to be the immediate next of kin of that person. So you send off. You'll get the full service records back. I think it's about £30. It'll take a bit of time, but you'll get them. You'll get them eventually, and they should tell you everything. But failing that, there are other resources at your disposal. So Army Rolls of Honour. As we discussed on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission talk yesterday, if your ancestors were killed, they would have left much more of a paper trail than if they made it home. So sadly, deceased ancestors are a lot easier to find than those who survived. That's just the way it is. And the kind of things you can look at are Army Roll of Honour records for 1939 to 1945. These are basically military rolls, simply listing the names of those who died in battle. We have a collection from the National Archives spanning 1939 to 1945. They contain the details of about 171,000 servicemen covering all different ranks and branches of the service. So that's certainly somewhere you can look. The other one is British Army Casualty Lists, 1939 to 1945. So this includes over 1 million entries. These aren't just deaths. These are those who were wounded, taken prisoner, reported as missing, killed in action, died as a result of illness or an accident. And these will give you things like service numbers, ranks, regiments, information that essentially is very useful for ordering service records. So even before you try to order service records, I would recommend trying to find your ancestors online in some capacity anyway, because that will give you the details that will make ordering a lot simpler, particularly if they've got a name like Harry Hill, which was not an easy one to trace. So the other ones are, again, big thanks to our friends over at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission Debt of Honour. Those are available on our site, or you could go straight to see WGC. They record the names of about 1.7 million men and women from all three services who died in both World Wars. And you can find loads of information about them there. We also have Royal Navy, Army and Royal Air Force lists for Second World War. They will give you rank, branch, whether they received any medals and why, but they won't give you exact details of service. But one of the most detailed collections we have for the Second World War is our Prisoner of War collection. Prisoners of War, 1945. So this was released actually 5 years ago to tomorrow, I think. We released it in 2015 to commemorate the 70th anniversary of BJ Day. And this is a truly wonderful collection that we released in association with the National Archives. Very, very happy to get our hands on it, given the scarcity of records for the Second World War. And of course, with the war in the Far East, the treatment and plight of prisoners of war, Allied prisoners of war, is probably, I think it's fair to say, is one of the defining aspects. It's one of the things that springs to mind immediately when you think of Allied troops in the Far East fighting the Japanese. We know the stories, we know how appalling the treatment was. Part of the reason for that was that the Japanese military never actually signed the Geneva Convention. They were asked to in 1923. They refused to sign, but while they didn't sign it, they did say they would abide by the rules in there pertaining to the treatment of prisoners of war. But what they say and what they did, what they said and what they did were two very, very different things. And just looking at the casualty rates of prisoners of war by who they were held by shows how staggering this was. So if you were a British soldier and you were captured by the Germans, you actually had a very, very good chance of making it home. the care, medical treatment, and the conditions you would have been provided with wouldn't have been ideal, but they were survivable. So casualty rates for British POWs held by Germans was about 3.5%. And most of those casualties could be attributed to people who were already wounded when they were captured, or people who were shot while they were trying to escape. The story is very different for British POWs held by Japanese. The casualty rates for them was as high as 24%, 24.8% actually, so we can round it off to 28%. I mean, what a contrast. 3% for the Germans, 25% for the Japanese. The only ones who kind of, I mean, the Americans held by the Japanese suffered even worse. American POWs held by the Japanese had a casualty rate of 33%, so even higher than British soldiers. But of course, the worst were Soviet prisoners of war held by the Germans, who were viewed as subhuman by their captors and largely exterminated. So Soviet prisoners of war held by Germans had a casualty rate of about 57.5%, which is very, very high. Over 50, you had an over 50-50 chance of dying in captivity if you were a Soviet captured by the Germans. Anyway, so back to the story, back to our prisoner of war records. This is if you haven't checked it out already, I really do urge you to, even if your ancestors weren't captured, because it really is, it's an absolute historical goldmine. The collection actually dates all the way back to 1715, so it doesn't just hold it doesn't just hold. Sorry, I got an email that distracted me there. It doesn't just hold records for the Second World War; it also covers the First World War. But actually dates all the way back to the 18th century. So you've got prisoners captured during the Jacobite rebellions. You've got American POWs captured during the War of 1812 and held in Dartmouth. It covers a very large date range, but we are specifically looking at the Second World War today. And of course, given that so many British servicemen were captured during the fall of Singapore, records from the Far East make up a pretty big chunk. Actually, there's more records for Far Eastern prisoner of wars than there are for European prisoner of wars in this collection. But what you will find in there is, where do I start? All sorts, really. It's a real mixed bag of all sorts of documents that were made originally by the War Office, the Foreign Office, Colonial Office, Admiralty, Air Force. There's all sorts in there, and you just have to have a look at the list of National Archives series, which are available at the bottom of the search page for that collection to get an idea of what's in there. There is a lot. You've got original Japanese index cards for POWs. You've got lists of deaths collected by the War Office. You've got correspondence. You've got interrogation reports of repatriated servicemen looking at the conditions in which they were held. You've got reports on conditions on board the death ships, like the SS Maru. What's it called? Something Maru. You know, a lot of these awful ships that the Japanese used to transport prisoners on. I can't even. I'm looking at the list of series here now. There's hundreds. So you've got to check it out for yourself. But there's a lot of you will find a lot of the well-known prisoners of war in there. You know, what was his name? Ronald Searle, the cartoonist who created St. Trinians. He's in there. Eric Lomax, the author of The Railway Man, who was famously played by Colin Firth in the film a couple of years ago. All his records are in there. Also, a chap called Fergus Ancor, who was a magician and used his skills as a magician to stay alive. Some very, very, very interesting people in there. And if we've got time, we'll take a look at their stories. But first up, I wanted to take a look at Lieutenant Harry Hill. So, Lieutenant Harry Hill, when we came across his records, we almost fell off our chairs. So, one of the series in this collection is made up entirely of diary entries that Lieutenant Harry Hill made during his time as a prisoner of war. So let's have a quick look at the story of Lieutenant Harry Hill. There's actually a blog on the site that you can read about it in more detail if you're curious. So, but anyway, this is the story of Harry Hill. So Harry was 51 years old when he was captured during the fall of Singapore. So on the older end of the spectrum. He was a career soldier. He was born in Paddington in 1891. His parents ran a hairdresser's on Bidley Street. And he joined the army after briefly working as a peddler. He joined the British Army in 1910, and we can see from his World War One service records that he served in France with the 3rd Battalion of the Tank Corps. So good chance he was at the Battle of Cambrai, Cambrai, however you want to pronounce it. So this is a career soldier, a veteran of the veteran of the First World War. So he married his wife Annie Hanratty in 1918. From there, he was demobilised in 1919, but obviously was a soldier at heart, so rejoined the Royal Army Service Corps in 1923. By 1928, he'd risen to the rank of Staff Sergeant, and we can see by his records that then he was stationed in Quetta, which was on the the western frontier of what is now Pakistan, which back then was a very important British military base. Anyway, that's beside the point. So when he rejoined the army in 1923, Singapore would have been viewed as a benign posting. It was not an at-risk area. Part of the reason why the Japanese were able to take the British defenders by such surprise. But that did start to change when tensions rose with Japan, but not enough, obviously. By 1937, the British were establishing big new bases of operations, new ordnance depots and workshops in Alexandria and Singapore. And large numbers of members of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, Indian Army Ordnance Corps, which Harry was part of, and the Australian Army Ordnance Corps were dispatched to the region. And by the time the Japanese arrived, Harry was serving as an acting lieutenant, and he was captured on September. His records show that he was captured on September the 15th. So he was part of the fall of Singapore, the largest British surrender in military history. From there, Harry was sent to a camp called Shirakawa POW camp, which was in what is now Taiwan. So Shirakawa was opened in June 1943. It had originally been a Japanese army training camp and barracks, but it was located on this wooden hillside. It was about 10,000 square meters. It had bamboo fences, reinforced with barbed wire, that kind of stuff. And it was originally known as an officers' camp, as most of the men in the camp were senior officers, but there were quite a number of enlisted men there as well. But after a while, it became a kind of hospital camp. The medical facilities there were supposedly better, and it was meant to be a place where wounded, sick, or overworked POWs could be sent to get treatment, recuperate, and then be put back to work. Of course, that wasn't the case in reality. The treatment there was appalling. Sick, wounded, ill POWs were given little to no treatment and still forced to do back-breaking labour on a starvation diet. They cultivated and raised livestock, not for their own consumption, mind you. That was for the consumption of their Japanese captors, because protein was very hard to come by. So it wasn't all darkness, with that World War II era spirit. They did have some respite. They'd write stories, poems. Apparently, they did make their own magazine called Raggle Taggle, which would have things like sketches and material written by officers to boost morale. And I'm desperately trying to track down copies of that. Apparently, 400 copies were printed in 1947, and that was it. But I don't know where. There weren't just soldiers at this camp as well. There was actually a great number of former Boy Scouts as well. And they started a Scout Rover crew who provided much needed care for some of the sick and weaker men, and again helped keep the spirit of them going. But anyway, so while there, Lieutenant Harry Hill recorded at great personal risk to himself a diary which noted the names, ranks, regiments, backgrounds, and physical states of the servicemen dying around him. And it doesn't make for easy reading. By the end of it, he even notes how some of the inmates basically just gave up and died because, as he said, they were tired of life, which is incredibly sad to hear. But I'm going to bring up some extracts for you now, so we can read some out and give you an idea of the kind of things that Harry Hill documented. And it was very noble of him to do this. And the only reason these found their way into our collection was that after the war, Harry donated his diaries to the War Office, who then used them to determine the fates of the men that never made it home from this camp. And as well as the diary, there's a load of correspondence showing how some of the American servicemen that were already held at that camp, their information had been passed on to the American military authorities thanks to Lieutenant Hill's diaries. So I'm just bringing up my notes. I seem to have lost them. Bear with me. So I can go 30 seconds. Got them. So to give you an example, there's a chap called Gunner Day, for example. Gunner Day is one of the entries who died due to a plethora of illnesses, essentially, which caused such weaknesses that he could not even move. He had to be assisted to perform the most basic functions, such as drinking water. Of course, he suddenly died. And again, to reflect that our prisoner of war collection isn't just British servicemen. You've got all sorts. You've got lots of Americans in there, like this chap here, another prisoner, Hughes, who was a US cavalryman. He died on arrival at the hospital after the Japanese basically refused to treat him for his wounds, even throughout his arduous journey to the camp, and he was cremated. Apparently, the inmates weren't particularly happy. His fellow prisoners of war weren't particularly happy about him being cremated, and Hill gave the reason for it. Hill said that the reason they did this was that his ashes, it was so they could carry around his ashes to confirm that he was still actually on the transport party that he'd been assigned to, if that makes sense. Actually, I'm going to bring up some real entries now because I was looking at this. So rather give you the originals, I think that'll be a bit more interesting. So here we go. So there's another chap here. This is dated to the 22nd of September 1944. Colonel Posthumous, that's all it's related to. It was a retired Dutch colonel. Was on roll call at 2000 hours. Went and saw the MTO. Afterwards, he said he had a pain in his side, and about a minute to 2100th hour, light out, suddenly dropped dead. So let's have a look at a few more entries. Back to Hughes. Yeah, I'll give you the full entry for Hughes, who was with the US cavalry. So it said he was brought in on a stretcher and died soon after arrival, and was one of the 4 American survivors whose ship was sunk. After being toted around with, no doubt, no treatment on board ship, then by rail and an open lorry, still without doubt, no treatment, still without doubt, no treatment, it is little wonder that he died of pneumonia upon arrival, with no possible hope of saving him. It is said that the body is to be cremated, the explanation for cremation being that he belongs to a party that is in transit and that it is not definite that the party will stay in this camp, in which case, if the party moves on, his ashes will also be taken to prove that he belongs to that party. But no, we've got a guy called Brigadier Knight, part of the tank regiment. He's died suddenly of heart failure, was walking about yesterday and appeared to be quite okay. Came with the party from the mining camp, then suddenly dropped dead. Again, this is a very sad one. A guy called Hume, who was with the Reconnaissance Corps. He says, came with a party from Hato camp, and as far as can be gathered, died of nerves and depression. And this is something you see quite a lot in the diaries. There's one chap, he remarks, as I said before, tired of life. And by the end of it, he's writing about it like it's almost part of the course. He just says, oh, another chap died yesterday. He'd become completely desensitized to this. And it's no wonder when you think of what Hill and his fellow POWs had to live through. But Hill did make it home, thankfully. He was eventually transferred to another camp. He was transferred to a camp called Fukuoka 17, which was on the Japanese island of Kyushu. He was sent there, I think, in 1944, but his ordeal was far from over. This was not a very nice camp either. Actually, the camp commandant, Asao Fukuhara, was executed after the war for war crimes. And the unidentified camp surgeon was known to force men who were critically ill to work. And the reason for that was they were making very good money. The camp was leasing men to a local mining company called the Mitsui Mining Company, and they were so the Japanese army were leasing these POWs for work down the mines, as well as in a zinc foundry, which is where Lieutenant Hill would have worked. And there were 2 meals served a day at this camp, usually 1 cup of rice and radish soup. Again, you'd very rarely get protein. You know, they'd all be cramped into these small rooms with one 15-watt light bulb for illumination. And there was little to no heating whatsoever. So yeah, very, very tough conditions. But eventually, Lieutenant Hill and his comrades were liberated on the 2nd of September 1945, by which time most of the POWs who were found there were in a very, very, very desperate state of health. Many were suffering from severe beriberi, and most of them had lost an average of 60 pounds, 27 kilograms, if you like. They were then evacuated via the ruined city of Nagasaki about 10 days after liberation, and we do know that Harry and his wife returned to England, settling in the northwest, and he died in Liverpool in 1965. So yeah, I just wanted to remember Lieutenant Harry Hill and his bravery in recording what was going on around him, because if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't know this. So we'll have a quick look at some of the comments coming through. Audrey saying the prisoner of war records are particularly good for the Far East. Thank you, Audrey. In the Second World War, if you click on the link World War II, 1939 to 1944, 5 Far East archival references, you can see at the bottom of the page, you can see many of them include lists of casualties, lots of details you won't get on the CWGC or indexes to war deaths. Excellent point. Do that. Do check out the series that are in there. Let's have a look at some of the comments. So Jean Dixon said, my dad was in the Lanarkshire Yeomanry, captured, held at Changi. Oh, you'll have to look in the collection, Jean, if you haven't already. There's loads of records from Changi. There's some photos in there as well, actually. Then Kinakaiseki copper mine, then finally a jungle camp. Sailed back 4 years later from Australia to Liverpool, told to make his own way home. Wow, and not to talk about it to anybody. Different times. He was a lovely, kind, and calm man after all that, which is an incredible thing indeed. Thank you very much for sharing that, Jean. That's yeah, important. It's important to remember these things on dates like this. Elysia Quamby said, my mother was born in India and joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps. Thank you very much. I'm glad you reminded me of that, because I do want to highlight that many, many women played incredibly important roles as well. So she joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in India, abbreviated to WACI, and she discovered she worked in intelligence. Oh, well, good luck getting your hands on her records. My grandfather was also given an emergency commission into the Indian Army. Wow, which shows how desperate the situation was. Again, thank you very, very, very much for sharing that. William, great, with another great recommendation. Google FIPOW Association, the Malayan Volunteer Corps. Relatives of those involved and have researched heavily, so lots of records available online. Pat Adamson said, my great uncle George Lowes was a POW. I have a letter written home to my grandma when he was released and was on his way home. He reckoned being ill in the hospital saved him at the end, which when you look at the stories we've just been looking at is quite remarkable, actually. Very, very, very lucky. Let's have a look at a few more. Thank you, everybody, by the way, for sending in these comments. There are loads. Yeah, Lynn Marie saying, makes me weep learning of the activities in camp to keep spirits up and life going. Amazing. Yeah, it's the kind of sense of the way the lengths people went to keep them to morale up and keep each other alive is incredible. And when you look at Hill's diaries and the fact that people were giving up of life and dying of shot nerves and depression, shows how important that was. That was a real key part to keeping yourselves going. And actually, on that note, we will take a little quick look at Ancorn, who was Fergus Ancorn, the magician. So Ancorn was also captured during the fall of Singapore on the 13th of February. He was a passenger in a lorry when it was hit by a bomb, blew through the vehicle and nearly took off his right hand. A surgeon was able to save his right hand because Ancorn told him that his profession, pre-war profession, was a conjurer, and he wasn't going to be a very good conjurer with just one hand. So he'd been performing since a very young age, performing for scouts, women's institutes, and when he enlisted, he became very well known amongst his fellow soldiers for the magic tricks he'd perform at army concerts. After surgery, he drifted in and out of consciousness, and the hospital he was in was overtaken by the Imperial Army, who started to kind of indiscriminately kill patients and staff. They probably believed Ancorn was already dead because he was, on the verge, which is why his life was probably spared. But so anyway, after the massacre of Alexandra Military Hospital and the fall of Singapore, he was taken to the very famous Changi prison. Um, and in the early days of the camp, this didn't last, but the men there were given the freedom to move around, sort of. So began to organise theatre groups and lectures to keep their minds off prison activities. Um, they couldn't offset the effects of poor nutrition and inadequate food supplies, but they could boost morale, which was also very important. But fit soldiers who were once fit and robust when they arrived were reduced to skeletal figures with, sunken faces and dark eyes, which you'll often see in the pictures. But Ancorn was just so inventive. So one of the things he wrote memoirs, which is how we know this information. So one of the things he did, he couldn't participate in heavy labour because one of his hands was so badly damaged. So like repairing the Singapore docks or carrying sacks of rice, and this put him at risk because if he couldn't work, he wasn't of much value. But thankfully, he did find a job collecting flies. So the Japanese military would pay 5 cents a day for prisoners to trap flies in the hopes of stopping the spread of dysentery. So flies could be found everywhere, particularly around cookhouses and latrines. But the prisoners became so effective at the work that flies eventually became in short supply. And this is where Ancorn used his inventiveness to help his fellow man. So Ancorn started originally to collect maggots and secretly breed his own flies. He had a black market fly breeding operation going, and he'd sell these breeded flies he'd give these breeded flies to his fellow prisoners, who could then sell them to the Japanese guards to help them get food and nutrition. He also used his skills at sleight of hand to even make his own flies from rubber tires and cellophane. But eventually, the smell of burning rubber nearly gave him away, and he had to give that up. But he performed a lot of magic. So he performed with a Dutch illusionist who called himself Professor Cortini and apparently claimed to be a nephew of Houdini. We don't know if that's true, but the kind of acts they do. So in one act, Ancorn and Cortini would appear on a dark stage, and they would give the impression of changing into a skeleton and then back into a man. And Ronald Searle, the guy who wrote St. Trinians, helped with this. He drew the skeleton on the black cloth for the show. I just love bits like this. It wasn't all doom and gloom. There were moments of the prisoners created their own moments of joy, which is a real testament to the human spirit, I think. Eventually, Ancorn was sent up country to work on the Burma-Thailand Railway, and we all know how that went. And he was able to survive that. We don't quite know how, probably by using his magic again, before eventually being transported to Chung Kai prison in Bangkok. Like Shirawaka, the one that Hill was sent to, it was designated as a hospital, but it didn't really act as one. Ancorn worked in the camp preparing the dead for burial, which must have been incredibly difficult for him. But he, on some days, he would prepare up to 15 bodies at a go. And through his own self-determination, he made sure that every day he remained clean-shaven, washed, and active in order to keep his spirits up. But yeah, his magic saved his life. He would use his magic to entertain the Japanese guards, who absolutely loved his tricks and would often give him food as a reward. So he'd often, and another thing he did as well was, because the Japanese often viewed prisoners as inferior, they wouldn't eat food that the prisoners had touched. So Ancorn would normally be very careful to incorporate food into his tricks, because the Japanese then wouldn't eat it and he'd be able to share it out. So one day he asked to perform a magic trick for a visiting Japanese general and requested 50 eggs to help him practice, even though he only needed one egg. What did this mean? It meant that by the time the magic show was over, Ancorn had 50 eggs, and he used them to make a giant omelette to feed his fellow prisoners of war. Protein that they desperately needed, and almost certainly saved lives. By the end of the war, Ancorn and his chums knew the war was coming to an end, and Ancorn, Searle, and Lomax were all liberated and survived to tell their stories, and the stories of the many, many thousands who didn't. And I recommend look all of them up. So I'll give you those names again. Those names are Fergus Ancorn, the magician, Ronald Searle, the man who behind St. Trinian's, and Eric Lomax. Essential reading, all three books. So let's have another quick look at comments and questions. So Sue Leach said, I noticed the Australians sailed for China without support from Britain. Maybe if they'd waited a lot more would have made it. True, but I think it was very noble of them to go for it and go out there. Rose Didon, yeah, saying thanks for acknowledging tomorrow's VJ Day. Well, I think it's genuinely important. I think I say this in a lot of these live broadcasts, but Robert Maxwell Edwards' epitaph, which was actually written for the Comina Memorial, which is in India, which holds the bodies of Commonwealth soldiers who died fighting the Japanese. But he wrote the epitaph for that memorial, and I think it sums it up perfectly. The famous one: when you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today, which they did. They gave their tomorrows for our today. And a lot of the freedoms and privileges we enjoy today were paid for by the lives of these men. So, yeah, very, very important we remember them. And actually, on a final note, before we do end, I did just want to make a bit of an acknowledgement of how much of a Commonwealth effort this was. Obviously, the Australians made an incredible contribution towards fighting the Japanese. There were there were millions of Australian soldiers in the Far East, and they fought very hard and very long. But of course, one of the sacrifices I do feel is quite often overlooked is the contribution of the Indian soldiers. Soldiers from what was then British India, so modern day India, Pakistan, Kashmir, those surrounding regions. So one of the things I didn't know was that at the start of the Second World War, the Indian Army numbered just under 200,000 men. But by the war's end, on August the 15th, it had become the largest volunteer army in history, with over 2.5 million Indians answering the call. Well, 2.5 million men from India answering the call, British Indians and Indians, but the vast, vast, vast majority were Indians. They largely served as infantry, and troops from what is now India and Pakistan proved to be incredibly proficient, determined, fearless soldiers. They fought their way across Africa, Europe, and Asia, but the majority of their forces doggedly held off the might of the Japanese military as the Allies were pushed out of Malaya, pushed out of Burma, pushed all the way back to the Indian border. So these men were not just fighting in defense of Britain and her empire, they were fighting for their homes, their families, their villages, their loved ones. Because if those regions fell, they knew what would happen. India would be next. They knew the Japanese would march into India. But yeah, a staggering number of Indian soldiers volunteered to fight. Staggering number. And over 87,000 of them paid the ultimate sacrifice. Over 34,000 were wounded. A further 67,000 became prisoners of war. And if you thought the treatment of British prisoners of war was bad, it was even worse for the Indians. When the war was won, their incredible contribution was acknowledged by those in power. Winston Churchill famously commended them. He commended the unsurpassed bravery of Indian soldiers and officers. And you had senior military officials like Field Marshal Auchin Lek, can never pronounce his name, who openly said Britain could not have made it through both world wars if it hadn't been for the help of the British Indian Army. Couldn't have done it. But I personally feel in the 75 years since, the level of contribution they made isn't given the attention it deserves. So I'd like to invite you all to have a look, browse through our Victoria Cross records and have a look at the stories behind the incredibly brave warriors, I think it's fair to call them warriors, of the British Indian Army, who fought incredibly hard for incredibly long and were incredibly tenacious in combat and incredibly brave. In fact, when you look at the total number of Victoria Crosses awarded in the Far Eastern Theatre, if you exclude Air Force and Royal Naval personnel, Slightly more Victoria Crosses were awarded to Indian ground troops than to their British counterparts, British-born counterparts. So I think 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded to Indian soldiers in the Far East, whereas 10 were awarded to British-born troops. So if you include British but Indian troops, there were 3 British-Indian VC winners. It's 13. So, but anyway, I think that's a true testament to the incredibly important role they played, and a reminder of the real debt of gratitude owed to all who served, all across the Commonwealth. Very, massive debt of gratitude. I was going to talk through some of their stories, but we don't have that much time. But I'll give you an idea of what the kind of stuff these amazing men did. So, for example, one chap, Ram Sarup Singh, who was born in Tanwar, who was born in the Tanwar Rajput Valley in Mahandagar. So I really should, considering I'm in awe of these men, I should learn how to pronounce their hometowns. So basically on 25th of October 1945, at Kennedy Peak in Burma, now Myanmar, 2 platoons were ordered to attack a very strong Japanese position. The platoon commanded by Subadar Singh, Subadar being a rank in the Indian Army. I think it is. What is Subadar? Let me just remind myself. Subadar is Subadar is captain. So he was a captain. So this is Captain Ram Sarup Singh. So Captain Singh was leading the 2 platoons that were tasked with taking out this incredibly strong Japanese position. And he'd very early on in the attack, they came under heavy fire, and almost immediately Captain Singh was wounded in both legs. But despite being wounded in both legs, he insisted in carrying on. He wasn't going to let his boys down. Later, the enemy counterattack was halted by Captain Singh rallying his men. You could just tell by the descriptions that his men would follow him anywhere, and he was a great leader. So he rallied his men and led a near suicidal countercharge, in which he killed 4 of the enemy himself. He was again wounded, but continued to lead his men, killing 2 more of the enemy, before he was finally mortally wounded. And I'll read his full citation here. So it says, in Burma on the 25th of October 1944, actually that's basically just saying what I said. So I'll read the important bit. It said, every approach was covered by medium and light machine guns sighted in bunkers. The platoon of Subdar Singh at once charged the position with another section. This instantaneous action completely bewildered the enemy, who fled from the bunkered positions, suffering casualties in their retreat. The Subdar was wounded in the legs, but took no notice of his wounds. While he was consolidating his position, the enemy opened heavy fire with grenade discharges, and at the same time put in a charge against the advancing enemy, bayoneting for himself and checking them. Although badly wounded in the thigh, he got up and ignored his wound, again went for the enemy, shouting encouragement to his men. He bayoneted 1 soldier and shot a further one, but was mortally wounded by a burst of medium machine gun fire in the chest and neck. It was difficult to find a finer example of cool bravery, cheerfulness, leadership, and determination. His action had a profound effect on the rest of the company, and when volunteers were called for to bring in his body, under heaviest fire, the entire company volunteered. Wow. God, I always get a bit of a lump in my throat reading stuff like that. So, so hats off to Subdar Singh and all his fellow soldiers. So I think we'll leave it at that for now, though I did have more stories I wanted to talk about. We have blogs on the site for tracing do visit our blog if you're looking for tips on tracing your World War II ancestors. We have guides for British and American armed forces. Do check out our collection of prisoners of war records. And a huge thanks to everybody who has commented. In the 1 minute remaining, I'm going to have a quick look at some of the comments. Audrey Collins, are the Gazettes going to be added to the British newspaper archive? I believe so. Don't quote me on that, Audrey. I'll find out for you and I'll let you know. Jean Dixon said the saddest of all this is that they talking about I think that's in relation to another comment. So Elsa, yes, I'm going to give the library a big plug too. So she says, Elsa Churchill of Society of Genealogists fame has said, going to give the Society of Genealogists Library a bit of a plug. We have books, biographies, guides, and indeed some donated collections related to civilian internees in the Far East, 1941 to 1945. Yes, they're neighbours of ours and are good chums, the SOG, and if you are ever in East London, do pay their library a visit. It's fantastic. Do say hello and explore the many wonders contained within. Thanks for that, Elsa. And popped a link in as well. Very, very helpful. Linda Bonner said, my dad was sent to Burma at the end of 1944. He was a radio signals man who went to Normandy on D-Day +1 and then to Belgium. Wow. When he was called back to London and sent to Burma. Whoa, he saw it all, didn't he? Poor chap. He was part of Force 136 and something called the IFBU, a radio unit of some sort. I know they had to destroy all their documents before they came home in 47. Maybe like early special forces, sounds like. He even got priority over officers for an internal flight one day. Yeah, it sounds like he was doing some pretty top secret stuff. Well, as you said, all top secret. He never spoke of it. His sister still knows nothing about it. He only applied for his medals 3 years ago when his youngest grandson was interested. He died 2 years ago, so I'm still trying to find out more information about the units he was with. Whoa, that does sound amazing. If you find anything, let us know. So I think, thank you. People say thank you. They've enjoyed it. Fitting commemoration for for VJ Day. I truly believe in. So thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all again in the not too distant future. Again, huge thanks to everyone who commented, and I think I'm going to end this by repeating the fantastic words of Robert Maxwell Edwards. Well, actually, no, I'll do the other one, because we've had when you go home, tell of them and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. I can't remember it. Tell them of us and say. John Maxwell Edwards. Sorry, I've been saying his name wrong the whole time. It was John Maxwell Edwards, not Robert Maxwell Edwards, who wrote these epitaphs. But okay, so we've already said when you go home. This is another one I think is a good one. Went the day well, we died and never knew. But well or ill, freedom, we died for you. I think that's the perfect way of summing it up. So yeah, let's all remember the incredible sacrifices paid by an entire generation. And I will see you all again soon. Yeah, I am sounding a bit hoarse. I forgot to bring in some water. So I'm off to have a nice cup of tea. Enjoy your weekends. Stay safe. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.